So Arkham Shadow has just been released. From the reviews I've read, people are saying that it's one of the best VR games ever made, and a solid entry in the Arkham series. Maybe Shadow will do for VR what the original Arkham Asylum did in 2009 and encourage a veritable feast of acclaimed comic book video games, ready to take advantage of this new demand from casual and hardcore fans alike. That is what happened after Arkham Asylum, right? Right? It's been 15 years since Arkham Asylum was released, and in that time the only superhero games that I can think of that emulated its success other than the Arkham sequels would be Sony's recent Spider-Man games. I haven't played them, but I know they've been incredibly successful. They might have bridged the divide between casual and superhero fans better than the Arkham games really, but other than these examples, can you think of any superhero game that has had the same impact, or the same blend of commercial and critical success? I can't. I remember the hype surrounding Square Enix's Avengers game, but it came and went without much of a trace at all. Given the unbelievable cultural dominance of superhero films, it's strange that Arkham Asylum's success didn't lead to a similar flood of superhero games that enjoyed the respect and success of the MCU or the Dark Knight trilogy. Something to bear in mind perhaps as we go forward. I have a long history with this particular game. I first came across it at a restaurant, if you can believe that. It was one of those places that had a play area with a video game console that was bolted into the wall. I only managed to play the opening scene. I don't even think I actually got to fight anyone, but it didn't matter. I was hooked. I remember sitting in the car on the way home just thinking about it. For some reason, that small taste left an incredibly strong impression. I mentioned it to my dad, and sure enough, that Christmas, Arkham City, thank you. No, this... it's the... Okay. It, of course, wasn't a problem. I was very grateful. It was a very thoughtful gift, and no less enjoyable when I got round to it. But the thought of starting on the second game in a series made me feel violently sick. So I went to buy a second-hand copy with my Christmas money, and finally, the game I had been dreaming about was mine. Needless to say, it didn't disappoint. I played through it and its sequel over those few weeks and would return regularly to beat it again. For a while I probably would have cited it as my favourite game of all time if anyone had asked me. I didn't have many friends who played video games, and those that did tended to play Halo, which I loved, and later Call of Duty and games like that. No one I knew played this game, so the experience of playing it felt so individual. It's like the game was mine and mine alone. In this period of time, before I knew about any retro games or pretty much any console released before the PS2, you can see why this game in particular felt so special. My passion for this particular medium was growing into a serious hobby, expanding from what had previously been more of a casual interest, and this game felt like the catalyst for this transformation. It's been about 5 years since I last played through Arkham Asylum, and in that time I've played so many other games, enjoying so many new and unique experiences, but this series was no longer a key part of that. I tried Arkham Origins, but didn't get very far, and by the time Arkham Knight came around, I'd moved on to other things. Until recently, that is, when Arkham Knight was recommended by a friend, thanks Jodie, who persuaded me to give it a second chance. I thought I would, but before that I wanted to revisit the other Arkham games, to play each of them in turn and analyse how and why they work. I haven't played Arkham Asylum since I started writing these videos, and I wondered how my opinion of it would change when viewing it through a more critical lens. A quick note here, I was playing this via the Return to Arkham collection, which I feel is worth a mention. I've always thought that this was a good remaster, and I certainly remember enjoying it when it came out. It's been so long since I've played the original game that I would struggle to do an in-depth comparison as far as the differences are concerned, but the visuals have obviously been updated, and you can play as Joker on Xbox, which is a nice bonus. Aside from a few frame rate issues, I would say this was a fine way to experience the game, and one that is respectful of its original qualities. There isn't anything that outright changes the game, at least as far as I'm aware. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. This is an Arkham Asylum retrospective. I think it's important to understand the landscape that Arkham Asylum was released into. There have always been superhero games, but I would argue that until Arkham Asylum, most of them suffered from one or more issues that hindered their longevity. The first of these is simple. Some of them were just bad. This, of course, isn't unique to superhero games, but one needs only think of the discourse surrounding a game like Superman 64 or the vitriol aimed at many licensed games from companies like LJN to see how an association between old superhero games and a lack of quality could be established. These games seemed like prime targets for internet reviewers that then shaped conversations about them going forward. Superhero games aren't the only games that provided such fertile material for online critics and comedians, but I do wonder if the established lore of superhero properties made it easier for people online to criticize them, and thus propagate this negativity. It's a comment no doubt familiar to anyone who remembers watching this kind of content. Superman flies through the rings, did that ever happen in the show? Wolverine fights the Grim Reaper, did that ever happen in the comics? Well, that one might have done actually, it wouldn't surprise me. But you see my point. Superman 64 has such a level of recognition that I would place it amongst the most well-known superhero games ever made. It's just that this reputation is gained from its notorious lack of quality. It's infamous, but this is fame nonetheless. Add to this the several other games that are either incredibly mediocre or just haven't aged well, and you're left with a much smaller selection of titles that will stand the test of time, at least for the right reasons. The second problem is that even good superhero games were often stuck on consoles that couldn't accurately replicate the source material and thus limited the experience of the player. Let's stick with Batman as the example. I love the 1990 game from Sunsoft, just titled Batman the Video Game. I think it's great, it looks good, has good music, all of that. But it's a 2D platformer. You move, you punch, you shoot. Mechanically, it doesn't offer anything unique. There's nothing I can do as Batman that I can't do as, say, Ryu in Ninja Gaiden, for example. I've never played The Adventures of Batman and Robin or the 2 X-Men games on the Mega Drive, and whilst I would really like to get hold of them, it's more because they look like decent side-scrolling action games that happen to star characters I like. I can play as Batman, or Nightcrawler, or Gambit, but I don't get to feel like them. This isn't just to say old game bad and new game good. Trust me, I love as many old games as I do newer ones for completely different reasons. Like I said, I love Sunsoft's Batman game, it's great, but I like 8-bit platformers, and this happens to be an 8-bit platformer, just with moody lighting, cool music, and the knowledge that I'm playing as Batman. The gap between the 1989 film and this game is much wider than the gap between The Dark Knight and Arkham Asylum. And this is nobody's fault, that's just how technology develops, but it can often make coming back to the Sunsoft game more an exercise in nostalgia than anything else. A modern player who likes Batman but is put off by older games might not enjoy this one even if it's a character that they like. To play it now is to play a good side-scrolling platformer, not to feel like you're really Batman. Finally, there's the issue of many superhero games being movie tie-ins, a genre so often plagued by mediocre titles and uninspired choices. There are definitely good ones. This is not to say that every single movie tie-in game is bad, I know that's not true. Treyarch's Spider-Man 2 seems to garner particular praise, but good movie tie-in games seem to be seen as exceptions to the rule, a nice surprise that this game designed to market a film is actually not that bad. Anyone wanting to revisit the best that this genre has to offer risks becoming overwhelmed by the sheer amount of second-rate games that obscure those rare quality titles. Is it really any wonder then that Arkham Asylum enjoyed the reception that it did? Here we have a Batman game finally on a console powerful enough to comfortably provide the experience of being the titular character, with an original story that establishes its own continuity, capped off with a voice cast that includes a fan-favourite Batman and a fan-favourite Joker. I mean, you can see why people were excited. Given the possibilities that these conditions offer and the routes that Rocksteady could have taken, I think it was a smart move to localise this game within the Asylum itself. They could have attempted to recreate Gotham City or introduce the Batmobile, or done anything to widen this game's scope beyond what it needed to be, and perhaps beyond what could have feasibly been achieved by this studio at this time. It's one story, set in one place, told over the course of one night. Whatever its role as a Batman story, this is a video game first and foremost, and this premise offers more than enough to engage with. The Asylum is split into several sections, each with its own buildings to explore. You unlock each new location as you progress through the story, with the ability to go back and revisit them at any point once they've been cleared. Most of the backtracking will be to search for collectibles. The amount of busy work required to further the narrative is thankfully kept to a minimum. I think it's slightly annoying to have to visit Cash so he can tell you how to find Killer Croc. You could have just had Oracle tell you where to go, but this sort of thing doesn't happen very often. It's also made easier to swallow by the efficient design of the island. No area feels too out of reach or hard to get to. I just want to dwell on this point for a moment, as I think it's a fundamental strength of this game. The map, whilst large enough to explore, is ultimately small enough to feel manageable and also slightly claustrophobic. I know you're watching footage of me gliding around here, maybe you think this looks quite expansive, but the actual space on offer isn't really that sizable. You've only got 5 buildings to choose from, with an additional 3 outside sections to connect them all together. Obviously the plot centres around Batman being trapped in the asylum, but the finite nature of the map ensures a constant reminder of this fact and the helplessness of the situation. This feeling isn't just limited to the exposition at the start of the game, it's sustained throughout. It actually makes you feel like you're trapped. Prison walls are almost always visible whenever you're outside, with guard towers placed throughout the grounds as well. When you can travel the entire width of Arkham East by grappling to and from a few guard towers, you really get a sense of how little space you have and how heavily even this small area is guarded. A huge map just wouldn't feel as contained. No matter how much you improve and progress throughout your playthrough, you just can't shake the feeling that you're stuck on this island. Rocksteady chose to provide quality over quantity when it came to the different sections of the asylum, and with all the riddles, trophies, interview tapes and everything else, they make sure to squeeze the most out of each building. It's a rewarding place to explore, and I think the collectibles are at their best when they encourage this exploration. Early in the game, when the concentration of secrets was at its highest, going out of your way to explore was usually encouraged with the offer of a Riddler trophy. Finding them this way felt like a genuine reward for choosing to take the time to investigate your surroundings. I would be on a roof and go behind a tower or round a corner, and more often than not there would be something waiting to be found. This dynamic would be impossible to maintain. Eventually the player will just run out of places to explore for the first time, but the spacing and variety of the collectible system works to bridge what could otherwise become a tedious slide into repetition. Let's take the trophies again. They're at the most rewarding at the start of the game, when the only barrier to finding them is their placement geographically. When they're not locked behind an item that the player hasn't gotten yet, then the simple act of exploring is deemed good enough to warrant a reward. By the end of the game, however, when the opportunity to explore and the high concentration of trophies have both expired, the player has acquired all the items that were previously unavailable. The thrill now is in the ability to revisit areas that were previously inaccessible. You will almost certainly notice these areas as you progress through the game, grates you can open or electrical gates that you can disable, and I know that I made a few mental notes as I found them. The feeling of returning to these places with the necessary abilities is as potent as accidentally discovering a trophy early in the game, but it's a completely different type of satisfaction. One rewards an open curiosity, the other rewards focused problem solving. There is a case to be made that these problems are too simplistic, and I can understand why someone might think that. Especially once you find the secrets maps, the experience essentially boils down to go to a question mark and do the thing. Grates, electrical gates and weak walls all show up in detective mode, so it's usually not very difficult to find what you need to do. The maps are also collectibles themselves, and so it makes sense to pick them up as you find them, which then runs the risk of making remaining collectibles too easy to find. I don't think this makes the trophy system redundant, however. The earlier buildings have several rewards that are locked behind barriers that you're unable to access at that point, so the satisfaction lies in returning to previously visited areas with your new skill set, as previously mentioned. By the time you get to the later buildings, you have most of the necessary items, but before you get the secrets map, there's still the opportunity to look for the trophy locations, in the knowledge that you can access them straight away. They may be easy to spot in detective mode, but there's still some mystery as to their location before you get the map. They could be anywhere in a building, and looking out for them whilst also exploring the building for the first time is where the challenge, and thus the satisfaction, lies. Sure, it gets easier once you find the secrets map, but by that point you would have already found several collectibles on your own. The additional clues provided could almost be seen as a reward for making it that far without them. Not to mention that sections like the elevator room had so many different layers that the hints didn't really help at all. The map is flat and so doesn't differentiate between different floors. As such, the hints are basically worthless and you have to scour each level to find all of the secrets. This is also one of the last buildings you visit, and so the rise in difficulty is appreciated. Any worry that the collectibles are only enjoyable at the start and end of the game is quickly dispelled by the riddles to solve in pretty much every room in the asylum. Finding the answer is its own reward, and these can usually be solved any time, with only a few of them locked behind certain items. These riddles encourage the player to think outside the box and engage their critical thinking skills as well as their sense of exploration. If I had one complaint about the riddles, it's that they do tend to repeat themselves a little bit. They will often boil down to find this villain reference, this is Two-Face's cell, this is Penguin's umbrella, and so on. It's not the end of the world. Once again, figuring out the riddle still requires you to go and locate the answer. I think I was just burned by the time I saw the black mask in Dr. Young's office and scanned it without even reading the riddle. I was so used to how they worked that it stuck out like a sore thumb, and sure enough...
Another one?
They're not all bad though, some of them were great. I loved seeing Ra's al Ghul in the morgue, and the mirror riddle was clever, as was any time you had to line up a question mark. Some of the dots were so small that you could so easily miss them, which made it all the more satisfying to finally figure out what you had to do. The other collectibles follow similar patterns when it comes to actually finding them, but differentiate themselves with their ability to enhance the game's story and atmosphere. The Amadeus Arkham stones are usually hidden inside the walls or behind weak structures, whilst the interview tapes are usually locked behind doors or electrical gates, but easy to find once you enter the room. Sometimes they'll just be lying out in the open, like on the benches in the botanical gardens. It's not the most engaging puzzle, but it's all about the destination with these ones. The tapes do a great job of fleshing out the secondary characters, filling in some of the gaps left by the main story. When I first played the game, these were by far my favourite things to find, and I'm excited to see them now, even though I know their contents almost by heart. Harley Quinn's tape is essentially a retelling of Mad Love in audio.
I'm surprised you want to intern here at Arkham.
I've always had a thing for extreme personalities. You can't deny there's an element of glamour to these super criminals.
I'll warn you right now. These are hardcore psychotics. Most would rather kill you than speak to you.
I'm sure I'll be fine, Doctor.
Riddler's tape delves into his psyche more than any film.
My father hated me. Always called me a moron.
I see.
I was determined to prove him wrong, so I entered a contest in school. A $20 prize to the kid who could figure out an almost impossible logic problem. I won, of course.
And that pleased your father?
Hardly. He was convinced I had cheated. He kept yelling, "You must have cheated! Admit it, you moron! You cheated!" I swore I didn't, and he hit me for lying.
I'm sorry to hear that, Edward.
Don't be. He was right.
Even if the Joker's tape is more focused on the game's narrative, serving as a sort of prequel, it's still a joy just to listen to these interactions. Putting one on as you wander these dark, empty hallways is such an eerie experience, I can't praise it enough.
Ah, the zombies.
They are all people, Victor.
They are zombies. Continuously shuffling through the daily grind, waiting for someone to liberate them.
Even if there are no collectibles to be found, sometimes the rooms are just their own reward. Seeing deserted cells or memorabilia from famous villains help flesh out this iteration of Batman's rogues gallery and always garner a favourable response whenever I stumble across them. Overall, these features result in an almost perfect setting, a place that is interesting to explore and walk around in. They make the asylum feel alive. The number of collectibles and variety they offer keeps them from feeling stale as the game progresses, and the limited size of the map allows them to be generously spread in various places. If the space was bigger, then you would either have a lower concentration of things to find, or you would need to increase the number of collectibles to a potentially unwieldy amount. This setting has a perfect balance, with enough things to find and enough variety to keep things interesting. Some collectibles are rewarding to find, whilst others are rewarding in what they provide to the player, namely the extra story details that expand the narrative further. It's a great system in and of itself, but one that also seamlessly fits in between the more focused gameplay sections. I often found myself ruminating on possible answers to riddles out of habit while stealthily taking out enemies, and looking for collectibles quickly became a post-combat routine. It's engaging but never intrusive, and the Asylum is a better setting because of it. Given the importance of the fighting mechanics throughout this game, it's fitting that the first thing you get to do after the opening scene where you just walk down the hallway is engage in a combat section. Joker leaves you in a room with a few henchmen, and the camera pans out as you gear up to take them down. And for this playthrough, I thought I'd try something different in relation to the combat. Not being shit. No, I wanted to maximise my engagement with the combat system so as to better inform my analysis of its mechanics. I'll admit, I usually resort to button mashing after a few fights, and whilst it served me fine throughout previous playthroughs, this time I wanted to learn the combat mechanics as the game intended me to do. I vowed to strive for high combos, to incorporate newly acquired moves into my repertoire. In short, I wanted to actively improve my fighting skills and take the time to get better at the game like I never had before. Would you believe it if I told you that it made all the difference? Instantly, every enemy encounter was transformed from an annoying break in the story to a new challenge, a new opportunity to practice my combat and hone my skills. I wasn't fed up when a new group of enemies appeared to block my path. I was excited to try a new move or go for a higher combo than the last fight. The ability to double tap A and move quickly around the room without losing my combo streak quickly became a lifesaver, and watching the fights play out was like watching a beautifully intricate dance, with each move rolling into the next. You're constantly adapting to the action happening around you. Incoming attacks need to be countered, so even when fighting a different opponent, you need to be aware of how many hits you're landing, otherwise you risk taking a hit yourself that could otherwise be stopped. You also need to keep an eye on how many enemies are on the floor and where they are in the room. Launch into an attack where everyone is knocked down and you risk losing your flow, unless you perform a ground takedown instead, although this too comes with its own risk, namely the oncoming attacks that you will be unable to counter until the takedown is complete. I like to think I got better as the game went on, but I still messed up occasionally. I would get carried away and miss an attack that could have easily been countered, or I would just take several hits in a row as I struggled to get my bearings for a moment. But when you get it right, as you glide through enemies like butter, ending on that final slow motion takedown and the satisfaction of a flawless free flow bonus, you really do feel like your practice has paid off. No less than Grant Morrison himself, acclaimed author and personal favourite of mine, said of this game that it was the first time in my life where I actually felt what it is like to be Batman. When taking full advantage of the fighting techniques that this game provides, I completely agree with such a sentiment. It's a shame then, given the strength of the combat system, that the bosses repeatedly fail to utilise these mechanics in interesting ways, and in contrast, stand as the weakest portions of the game. Several of the encounters are with Titan-infected henchmen, and to be fair, these fights are probably the strongest of the lot. Their addition into an already crowded room of enemies makes for an interesting dynamic. Not only can they not be harmed with your usual attacks, but they'll often charge into you or send a shockwave via a ground pound. Neither of these moves can be blocked, only evaded. It's easy enough to fire a batarang as they're running and then launch an attack whilst they remain stunned, but trying to do this whilst also fighting a wave of henchmen presents a far more engaging challenge. The Bane fight follows the same exact structure, which I would call lazy, but given the similarities between Bane and the creatures, I think it's an acceptable choice. Harley and Scarecrow, on the other hand, barely qualify as boss fights. Harley just watches you fight some henchmen before she herself is defeated in a cutscene.
Die, you big ugly bat!
The final battle with Scarecrow is similarly underwhelming, with you facing waves of skeleton soldiers and lighting up 3 successive bat signals until his fear toxin wears off.
How are you doing this? You've ingested enough toxins to drive 10 men insane. What are you?
The Joker fight at the end is in a similar vein, although at least here you do get to interact briefly with, the boss. You're pitted against waves of enemies again, but once they're defeated, you have to use the Batclaw to pull Joker down before he notices and sends in more henchmen. In between these fights, he'll step down into the pit and attempt to fight you. Although fight is perhaps too strong a word, he'll lunge at you, and you can try your best to evade him. You can't attack him, nor can you block his attacks. You just have to wait him out. We'll get into this later, but I'll say here that it's frustrating that you don't even get a chance to fight this iteration of the Joker. Don't get me wrong, I don't like this iteration, but I would understand it more if it was necessary for the final fight of the game. Given that you've been fighting Titan-infected creatures throughout your playthrough, with each encounter presenting a slightly greater challenge than the last, having the Joker be the culmination of this trend would make some sense from a gameplay perspective. But no, he mugs for the camera as you fight the same enemies again and again. Just pull him down 3 times and he's finished. Well done. Great job. Truly the hero Gotham deserves. The only real unique boss fights in the game are Killer Croc and Poison Ivy, but both of them suffer from boring mechanics and artificially extended run times that just make them a slog to get through. Croc's is first. In it, you have to navigate his lair to find some plants that will provide an antidote to the Titan venom. Your search will be constantly interrupted, however, as you must fend off Croc as he launches from the water and tries to take you down. I'll admit that when you get to a four-way crossing and you hear the music pump up, it makes for a tense few seconds as you frantically scan the walkways, trying to find the direction he's coming from before it's too late. The effect wears off quickly though, and once it's gone, you're left with little else. See Croc, press the button, fire the batarang. Rinse and repeat. I think what makes the encounter so tedious is the lack of agency on the part of the player. For example, the only way through the sewer is via these wooden planks on the water, and it's made clear that excessive noise will alert Croc to your presence, so a slower pace is advised. That will be fine, but Croc appears anyway throughout the fight, so what's the point of going slowly other than to needlessly prolong the encounter? It makes the decision to crouch across the planks feel meaningless, as you're just barely reducing the amount of Croc interactions. It's essentially a choice between seeing him all of the time, or just most of the time. Part of me wonders whether this section would have been better if it operated more like a maze. The sensor that tells you where to go is incredibly generous. It protects against even a single wrong turn, so actually finding the plants is never a problem. Perhaps it would have been more engaging if the plant was unable to be tracked and the player had to actively search for it rather than just follow the sensor. You could make the target a single plant rather than the 6 different ones that you need to find here to ensure that the task didn't overstay its welcome. You would have to look a lot harder, but only once. This would create a more satisfying system of risk-reward. The player would need to sweep the sewer on their own, giving an incentive to move quickly, but this would then be balanced by the appearance of Croc if they chose to do so. Alternatively, they could move slowly and avoid having to fight him at the cost of a longer search. You could argue that this would run the risk of avoiding Croc altogether, but once the player has found all of the plants in the original version, Croc will rise up and chase them back to the entrance. You're unable to knock him off the planks during these sequences, being forced instead to merely outrun him, and I see no reason why this couldn't be integrated into this reimagined boss fight. Maybe if the planks all connected to each other and there were no dead ends, then it would at least function as a genuine test of speed and skill, but in the actual boss fight, Croc will just give up if you make a wrong turn. There's little in the way of punishment. You could have Croc clamber over the planks rather than destroying them, and then the chase would last for as long as it would take the player to return to the entrance. You could even incorporate the batarang mechanic to slow him down at the cost of having to stop running for a moment or two, and you would still get your ending with the explosive gel by leading Croc to the entrance of his lair. I don't know. I guess it just feels so void of any player input. So much of the encounter feels out of my control when I play it. You go where you're told to go, you press a button when Croc appears, and you don't even get to defeat him at the end. It happens in a cutscene. The fight, if you could even call it that, functions solely as a way to collect the plants that will advance the story, with Croc included as an easy way to inject some tension into what otherwise would have been a fairly menial task. Speaking of plants, let's talk Poison Ivy. She has 2 attack stages. The first one involves roots that spring from the ground and grab you if you're caught near them. The second has her shooting projectiles at you whilst her protective screen opens and closes, offering an opportunity for you to deal damage with a batarang. Here's the problem. You can't harm her during the first wave, all you can do is wait for it to end. This would be fine if the vines were difficult to evade, but her attacks are easy enough to dodge that they don't present enough of a challenge to keep this portion of the fight interesting. It's not a test of your abilities to lazily jump out of the way, especially given how late in the game this fight takes place and so how proficient the player would most likely be by this point. It's surprising how lacking these encounters seem when taken as a whole. Given the varied nature and creative design of Batman's Rogues Gallery, one can't help but feel like the boss fights represent a severe underutilization of their potential. I've mentioned a few times now about how this game makes you feel like Batman. There's the combat, the detective work, the gadgets, but for me the experience most emblematic of this character is the ability to engage enemies with stealth tactics, to heighten their fear as you pick them off one by one. Think of the dockyard scene in Batman Begins. Where are you? Here. Classic. Once again, Arkham Asylum nails the smaller details of these interactions. Henchmen will pair off after finding someone unconscious, and their heart rates will increase as you work your way through them. They might start to abandon their friends in order to save themselves, and sometimes even fire their guns in panic as they frantically look for you. When you're perched on a gargoyle, surveying the terror that your very presence strikes into these nameless goons, then yeah, you do feel like Batman. It's pretty cool. Viewing this gameplay loop critically, though, exposes a weakness that even the brilliant enemy AI can't hide. The system is not quite as optimized as the combat is, and so suffers in comparison. The problem is that these encounters never feel that difficult. They're easy to get through for the most part as long as you're patient. Being spotted at any point is not usually an issue. The game is very forgiving of this particular mistake. Ascending to a gargoyle and swinging around for a few seconds is enough to disappear in the eyes of the henchmen below. This move also allows you to avoid their shots for the most part. It's not so easy that you'll never die. I died in a few of these sections, but it was most often the result of lazy and sloppy playing, which these stealth areas risk encouraging, thanks to the generous allowances for player error. The one exception to this, and so probably the best stealth level in the game, is this section in the Botanical Gardens, where you have to reach the control room without being seen in order to save the people trapped in the cages. This setup means that you only have one attempt to reach the top of the room, and the platforms themselves are very narrow, so it's a genuine test of skill and of your ability to utilize ventilation shafts and corners to evade detection. As enjoyable as this scenario was, however, it paled in comparison to the challenge maps. Completing all 3 tasks in a single round made it necessary to plan a strategy and often a specific sequence of events. It wasn't enough to just pick people off randomly. I had to wait for people to move to certain positions, sometimes using them as bait to get several henchmen huddled into a trap. Not only that, but the enemy responses were often punishing enough to drain my health after only one sighting. These 2 features encouraged more creative playing than any room in the main game. The trade-off, of course, is the longer time needed to achieve all 3 batarangs, but the satisfaction of completing these challenges is more than worth the time in my opinion, and provides a greater sense of accomplishment than any mainline stealth section. I don't want to be too negative on this point. It's still fun to take out a room of enemies. But compared to a combat system that manages to effortlessly accommodate the growing skill set of the player and reward creative playing, these sections can't help but feel underwhelming in execution. They experiment with a few gimmicks, such as the collars that go off when you take someone out, but I never found this to really change how I tackled these sections. Enemies find the bodies quicker than before, sure, but they still split up again afterwards, and the collars still give you more than enough time to hide yourself. On the other hand, the late game addition of explosives to gargoyles, effectively making them single use, is a brilliant way to force a more varied strategy from the player, but they abandon this feature almost instantly. Like I said though, there is more than enough to enjoy here. I suppose the extent to which I take all of these gameplay strengths for granted demonstrates just how many of Rocksteady's experiments were successful. I'm so used to these mechanics being refined in later games that I forget that they needed to start somewhere, and Arkham Asylum offers an innovative player experience that was unique for the time, even if some parts were more fully formed than others. As much as I can nitpick, I can't deny how fun it is to control Batman. In the end, maybe this is all that matters. When it comes to the story of Arkham Asylum, I can't help but feel the weight of previously released Batman content and think of the expectations born from all their individual merits. Maybe I've just been spoiled. There is so much Batman media out there, and so much of it is incredible. It's not that the story of Arkham Asylum is bad, it's more underwhelming. I mentioned at the beginning that just the fact that it told an original, fully realised story was to its credit at the time, and I stand by that. I just think that the main narrative is comparatively weak, and that this weakness has been obscured by the many additional stories told through the collectibles and the incredibly potent atmosphere. And before we get into this though, a brief spoiler warning. I will be talking about the plot, and so if you want to avoid any spoilers, then just skip to the time on the screen. Still here? Right. I want to briefly address the fact that the premise of this game obviously takes inspiration from Grant Morrison and Dave McKean's exceptional graphic novel of the same name. The plot very quickly diverges from this, so it wouldn't be accurate to call it an adaptation per se, but the basic story, that Batman goes to Arkham Asylum where Joker has taken over, is retained from the graphic novel. That's pretty much it though. They don't even start the same way. In the game, Batman brings Joker in, whereas in the novel, Joker is already there and Batman is called in to sort things out. The game also utilises the character of Amadeus Arkham from the comic, but his story and his identity are ultimately changed too, just worth a mention. Now, this game's story has the difficulty of trying to fulfill two slightly conflicting criteria. At a basic level, the plot exists to facilitate the gameplay. It gives a reason for the player to go from one challenge or one location to another, as well as provide justification for the introduction of certain enemies or bosses. It also has to stand up as a competent Batman story in its own right, with all of the lore and comparisons that come with any established franchise. These two things aren't mutually exclusive, but they do offer the potential to hinder one another. Like I mentioned earlier, going to find cash just to get Croc's location feels a bit tedious from a story perspective. Removing this task would make the plot more streamlined. But from a gameplay standpoint, this detour forces the player to return to the mansion, where they can practice using the line launcher to evade poison gas, and then take out the sniper in Arkham North, which uses the same technique. Getting to Killer Croc requires this gadget, and so the game allows you to become comfortable with it through this small plot diversion. It serves a gameplay purpose, just not a narrative one. At first, these two requirements are balanced quite well. Trying to find the Joker as he moves around the asylum provides a natural reason for the map to open up. You follow his trail as he visits each new location and take down his subordinates before finally confronting him. Being in the asylum offers a chance to incorporate other enemies without it feeling too forced. It's probably the best setting you could choose for a Batman game in this regard. Any Batman villain could feasibly be in the asylum and so could be brought into the narrative in a believable way. Given what I've said about the lackluster boss fights, it is a shame that the appearances from specific villains are not concluded in satisfying ways. Poison Ivy's plan to take over the island provides a decent escalation of the stakes, but it's resolved by a fight that only lessens the impact of her inclusion. This is the same for Killer Croc. Bane is a little more important. His inclusion provides a key part of Joker's plan. His Titan formula is harvested directly from Bane using Venom as its starting point. As mentioned, the actual Bane fight isn't amazing, but it feels far more essential to the plot, and the surprise of uncovering Bane is a great moment.
It wants Dr. Young's login.
Never mind that. Get behind me, now. Bane.
I thought he broke out of Blackgate.
Cut me down. Who did this to you?
Dr. Young, the Bruja. She drained the venom from my blood. Must stop.
His interaction with Batman actually humanizes him and portrays him as a sympathetic victim. Honestly, it might be my favorite characterization of Bane, in this one scene at least. But you all know who the best secondary villain in this game is. That's right, it's Warden Yes, his boss fight barely qualifies as one. Yes, he does get taken out in the most unsatisfying way possible, but his inclusion is so brilliant because it portrays him in a way that would be impossible in any other medium. If this is the game that makes you feel like Batman, then Scarecrow makes you feel the effect of his fear toxin just as strongly. He distorts the world around you, even pretends to crash the game, all to demonstrate the effect he has on Batman's mind. I can't praise this inclusion enough. It demonstrates some of the most creative visuals I've ever seen in a game. The jump scare as he comes out of the body bag or the slow transition into Crime Alley are just so impactful and perfectly translate the essence of the character. He might suffer from a bad finale, but it's still the best representation of any villain in the game. His appearances utilize gameplay and story choices that actually match and complement his creative design. He even comes back for a second time later in the game. Oh no, that's actually my game freezing. Okay, that's not Scarecrow, never mind. The flexibility of the narrative allows these characters to flow in and out of the story, all while the Joker's master plan simmers in the background. You might only meet with Joker a few times until the end, but hearing him over the intercom maintains his presence even as you're dealing with other problems.
Ding dong. Warden Joker would like to announce that as of today, all Arkham guards have been fired due to budget cuts. Hello again, boys. It's me. Please remember to take good care of all our hostages. They're no good to us dead. However, a bruise here or a cut there won't go amiss.
His constant talk of a party, of some big event waiting to happen, works well to ramp up the tension as you get further through the night. There's no real time to stop and take a breath, at least not in-universe, and when the music pumps up, you really do feel like the hero about to face a final showdown.
Pain and suffering, the effects were felt everywhere. My father fell first, infected by some foul disease. My mother lived on, but only in a dream.
It's the actual details of his plan, though, that lets the story down for me. It's serviceable for the game, but I don't think it would work in any other medium. It just doesn't fit the character of the Joker, at least not for me. His plan is to unleash an army of Titan monsters on Gotham, and that's it. It feels boring and too reliant on basic violence. Having people be beaten to death by monsters who have no concept of what they're doing just feels a little out of character. There's no greater narrative, the plan isn't conceptualized in any psychological terms. He mentions at the end how he wants to bring Batman down to his level, but this isn't backed up by the plan, he just says it.
I just wanted to bring down your grim facade and for once let you see the world as I see it, giggling in a corner and bleeding. But you've denied me even that.
The idea of trying to break Batman to make him realise how similar he is to the people he fights, this is the overarching Joker goal, the underlying motive of any scenario he creates. But mentioning it here just feels like lip service to that fact. Because however you dress it up, his plan in Arkham Asylum isn't about that, it's about using monsters to take over Gotham. Oh, sorry, that's just the Silver Age calling, they want their Joker back? I'm kidding, and actually if it were more like that era, I don't think I'd find it as underwhelming. If they emphasise the sillier aspects of the plan, which are definitely there, then the plan just being a generic take over the city plot could be excused. A story like The Laughing Fish is great because it plays into the silliness that is always underneath any Batman story. I like dark and gritty Batman, but I also like the 1966 film or the Lego Batman movie. Humour isn't inherently detrimental to this character. I think that the animated series is the best that the franchise has ever been able to balance these two opposing tones, but Arkham Asylum is clearly going for dark and gritty, which is fine, but look at him. Look at him. The game does all this heavy lifting, creating the atmosphere, building the tension, only to give you tonal whiplash when this is the finale. It's silly in concept, silly in design, but taken absolutely seriously in the story. The colours are still muted and the dialogue is still heavy, I just don't think it fits. It highlights this issue of a plot having to function on its own merits as well as to facilitate a game. Joker's plan does well to utilise the whole asylum, to build a mystery to solve, and to create stronger enemies to fight as the game progresses. But as a game, you'd need a final boss. And a plot in which the Joker is the main villain, centred around the Titan drug, means that this was always going to be the conclusion. I think the story is a letdown primarily because it forces this bad ending. Of course Joker is going to infect himself, and of course you're going to have to fight him, no other resolution would make sense, and the weakness of the boss fight only compounds the problem. And yet, despite this long takedown of the game's story, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. Maybe you're thinking that my ass must be sore from sitting on this fence for too long. That's not what's happening, I promise. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but it's just that, once again, the game has enough small successes to prevent this larger problem from completely ruining the experience. Yes, I have issues with the overall plot, but everything else, the acting, the script, the finer details, is brilliant. The dialogue in particular is fantastic, with so many funny lines. I had a hard time deciding which ones to put in.
Need to take my temperature? I'd be happy to drop my pants.
Joker.
You were expecting maybe Two-Face? Are you excited, Bats? I mean, we've been building up to this point all night. Don't tell me you've not been looking forward to it. I know I have. Surprise! Why didn't you stop Batman? Me? It was your plan, you goofy clown. If I see you trying to follow me, he dies. Harley's looking forward to it. Maybe I'll film it and post it on the internet. Tell me, Bats, what are you really scared of? Failing to save this cesspool of a city? Me? In a thong? don't you just give up? Go on, roll over and die for once. Be your best friend.
She's a good kid.
I could watch those two all day. What a riot! And speaking of riots, here's a bit of civil unrest I cooked up just for you.
Everything that comes out of the Joker's mouth is either hilarious or terrifying, and the other characters get a few good moments of their own as well.
Don't speak. You're safe now.
But it's a trap!
I know. Just not for me.
I'm losing patience. You're cheating. You must be.
Hey, scram, bats! This is my me time.
Thanks. Are you okay?
I'm fine. I eat punks like these for breakfast. What were they doing in here?
I know it's overdone, so I won't labour this point, but my god, Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill make this story so enjoyable to sit through. I know, coldest take ever, but I don't care. They are the definitive voices of these characters in my opinion, and just listening to them interact is worth the price of admission alone. This is the power of fan service when done right, because for as much as I can criticise the overall narrative, I can't honestly say that I don't enjoy the story, because it includes so many great moments. These moments fail to form a cohesive whole on their own, but I still enjoyed every one of them for their individual merits. Even though I knew how the narrative would conclude on this recent playthrough, I also knew about the great interactions, funny lines, and countless interview tapes that were a result of these story decisions, and they were all worth playing for. When it works, this is some of the best that this franchise has to offer. These actors truly bring their characters to life like no one else can. Conroy and Hamill get most of the attention, but Arlene Sorkin as Harley Quinn is also great. Her presence completes this golden trifecta. I've already said how much I rate the animated series, and these voices allow you to experience it in a newly mature light. I wish the story had been better, and I do think this blend of the serious with the silly ensured a tone that was difficult to pull off for the finale, but at the same time, it's a price I'm willing to pay overall if it means getting to revisit such iconic interpretations of these characters. When looking back over this script, I was surprised, to say the least. This is a game so close to my heart, one that, like I said earlier, was my favourite for a long time, and yet reading over what I've written, it feels far more negative than I intended it to be, seemingly out of nowhere. Was it always just nostalgia? Had I been remembering it wrong? Or was I just blind to its faults as a kid who just wanted to be Batman and fight the Joker? Okay, well, no, and kind of. I'll be honest, up until starting this channel, I never really took the time to think about the games I played in any great depth. I never contemplated the hidden meaning behind Gingerbread Man, and that's just the cross I'll have to bear. I would play something, and if I liked it, great. If not, I'd play something else. I always felt the boss fights in this game to be underwhelming, but I could never articulate why that was because I'd never bothered to try. In that same vein though, I always thought the combat was incredibly fluid and intuitive. Reflecting on this game has exposed some of its flaws more than I would like, but it's also given me a new appreciation for its gameplay, something that I always took for granted. I enjoyed the fighting sections in this playthrough more than I ever have. To find new things to appreciate in a game on your 6th or 7th playthrough is clearly a compliment. This game does so much more right than it does wrong, but I'll admit to being shocked by the close proximity of these two extremes. There's the setting rich in atmosphere that plays host to a story that feels generic and underwhelming. You get great interpretations of some of the best characters ever created, featured in boss fights that do nothing with them. But no game is perfect, and I hope I've made it clear that all of the problems with this game are tempered by some redeeming feature or another. I've tried to limit any discussion of the sequels in this video for two reasons. Firstly, because I haven't played them in a while and I wouldn't want to give opinions based solely on nostalgia. But secondly, I would never want to suggest that this game's value is in being a dry run for what would come later. Arkham Asylum is a great game in its own right, even if it does also offer a template ripe for improvements down the line. Its setting, in particular, evokes an atmosphere potent enough for this game to carve out a unique identity irrespective of any flaws. Unless I'm seriously misremembering the future games, none of them make you feel quite as trapped as this one does. A good story is important, but so is a good setting, and this game has that in spades. Arkham Asylum is still a demonstration of how good original superhero games can be. Maybe it's been equaled since, probably even bettered, but it's still a game worth returning to. Playing it again, even with a critical eye, was a rewarding and utterly enjoyable experience. This script took ages for me to write, and this is by far the longest I've ever spent working on a video, so if you did enjoy it and you've made it this far, then maybe it is worth subscribing. I don't want to twist your arm, but come on. I'm writing this before I've even started editing, but even I know that this is going to be a long video to watch, so if you've stayed this long, then I must have done something right. Look, I'll leave it with you. Like, comment, all that good stuff, but whatever you choose to do or not to do, you did watch it, and for that, I thank you. I have a few videos that I want to make after this that are not Batman related, but rest assured there is definitely an Arkham City retrospective in the works. The plan is to do all 4 games, just bear with me. A man can only take on the mantle of Batman for so long after all, and I want to cleanse my palate before jumping back into this series. It's only fair. I don't really know how to end this. I'm not used to a video being this long, so I'll just reiterate what I've already said, but still absolutely mean. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.